I never thought much about danger. Working nights at a 24-hour diner just off the interstate in rural Missouri, you'd think I'd have learned to be cautious. But nothing ever really happened. Sure, there were the occasional rowdy truckers or teenagers stopping by for late-night snacks, but for the most part, it was uneventful. That changed one Wednesday night in early March. I was covering the overnight shift, just me and a line cook named Eddie. Eddie was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a constant cigarette tucked behind his ear. He didn't talk much, but he could flip a burger faster than anyone I'd ever seen. The night had been slow. A few regulars came and went. Old men who ordered black coffee and grumbled about the news, truckers scarfing down eggs and hash browns before hitting the road again. By 2 a.m., the place was empty. I leaned against the counter, scrolling through my phone, while Eddie cleaned the grill in the back. The door jingled and I looked up. A man walked in. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 3 inches, with a heavy build and a faded denim jacket. His face was rough, weathered, like he'd spent too many years in the sun. His eyes, though, that's what struck me. They were sharp, almost predatory, scanning the room like he was sizing it up. "Evenin'," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the farthest booth, the one in the corner by the window, and sat down. I grabbed a menu and a coffee pot and made my way over. "What can I get you?" He didn't look at me. "Just coffee." "Cream or sugar?" "Black." I poured the coffee, my hand unsteady for reasons I couldn't explain. Something about him put me on edge. He didn't move much, just sat there staring out the window at the dark, empty parking lot. I returned to the counter, trying to shake off the unease. "Creepy guy, huh?" Eddie's voice startled me. He'd come out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Yeah," I muttered. Eddie glanced over at the man, then shrugged. "Probably just passing through. Happens all the time." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just tired. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man didn't drink his coffee. He didn't even touch the cup. He just sat there, staring out the window. Around 2:30, another customer came in, a young woman, mid-20s, with a backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked like a college student or maybe someone hitchhiking cross-country. She sat at the counter and ordered pancakes. As I was pouring her a glass of water, she leaned in and whispered, "That guy's freaking me out." I glanced over my shoulder. The man was still in the corner booth, but now he was watching us. His sharp eyes locked onto me, and I quickly looked away. "Probably harmless," I lied. The woman didn't seem convinced, and neither was I. About 10 minutes later, the man finally moved. He stood up, walked to the counter, and placed a $5 bill on the formica. "Keep the change," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, watching as he turned and walked out the door. The woman let out a sigh of relief. "Good riddance," she muttered. I wished I could share her relief, but something about the way he left didn't feel right. I stepped to the window and peeked outside. His truck was still in the lot, parked near the edge of the woods. The engine wasn't running, and he wasn't inside. "Where'd he go?" I murmured to myself. "What?" the woman asked. I shook my head. "Nothing." The rest of the night passed uneventfully. The woman finished her pancakes and left around 3 a.m. Eddie and I cleaned up the diner, and by the time the sun rose, I had almost convinced myself that the man was just a drifter, nothing more. But the next night, the news changed everything. A reporter on the local channel was talking about a missing woman. Brown hair, mid-20s, last seen hitchhiking near the interstate. It was the woman from the diner. My stomach dropped. I called Eddie immediately, but he hadn't heard anything. The police came by later that day, asking questions about the night before, but there wasn't much to tell. The man didn't leave a name, and his truck was gone by the time the morning shift arrived. Over the next few days, the story unfolded. The woman's backpack was found near a rest stop a few miles down the road. Her phone was inside, but there was no sign of her. The police released a description of a suspect, a tall man in a denim jacket, driving an old blue pickup truck. It was him. I gave my statement describing everything I remembered about that night, but it didn't feel like enough. Weeks passed, then months, and the case went cold. The man in the denim jacket disappeared as mysteriously as he'd arrived. I still think about that night, about the woman who came into the diner and the man who followed her. I think about the way he stared at us, like a predator sizing up his prey. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done something differently. Called the police sooner, warned her not to leave, but the truth is, I'll never know. What I do know is that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits in a corner booth, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. It was supposed to be a simple trip, 4 hours of driving to help my younger brother, Alex, move into his new apartment across the state. I'd made the drive before, long, straight stretches of highway cutting through open fields and forests. It was monotonous but peaceful in its own way. I left just before sunset, hoping to beat the late-night drowsiness. My car, an old sedan with a temperamental radio, hummed along steadily. The sky shifted from warm hues of orange and pink to a deep, velvety blue as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. Around 8 p.m., I found myself on one of those isolated stretches of highway where it feels like the rest of the world has disappeared. No other cars, no streetlights, just my headlights carving a path through the darkness. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible in the weak glow of my high beams, was a car pulled off to the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked faintly, cutting through the black. As I approached, I slowed down out of instinct. The car was an older model, maybe from the 90s, with peeling paint and a dented rear bumper. I could make out a figure standing next to it, waving one arm. A man, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing a hoodie and jeans. His other hand clutched a cell phone, which he kept glancing at. I don't know why, but something about the scene made me hesitate. Maybe it was the sheer emptiness of the highway, or the fact that the man's face wasn't visible in the shadows. But I remembered my dad's old advice. If something feels off, trust your gut. I slowed to a crawl, keeping my windows rolled up. The man jogged closer, waving more urgently. "Hey, can you help me out?" he called, his voice muffled by the glass. I cracked the window just enough to hear him. "What's going on?" "My car broke down," he said, pointing to the hood. "Battery's dead, and my phone's out of juice. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" The words were reasonable enough, but something in his tone felt practiced, like a line he'd rehearsed. "There's a rest stop about 10 miles back," I said. "I'm sure someone there can help." The man's expression changed. His shoulders stiffened, and his hand tightened around the phone. "Come on, man. Don't leave me stranded out here. It's freezing." It wasn't freezing. Chilly, maybe, but not unbearable. "I can call someone for you," I offered, keeping my hand near the gear shift. "No need for that," he said quickly. Too quickly. That's when I noticed something odd. The car's windows were fogged, but there was movement inside, subtle, like a shadow shifting. Someone else was in the car. "I'm sorry, I can't help," I said, rolling up the window. The man's face hardened. He stepped closer, and for a split second, I thought he might grab the door handle. But then he stopped. His lips pressed into a thin line as he stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "All right, suit yourself." I didn't wait for more. I hit the gas, speeding off into the night. My hands were shaking, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights tailing me, but the road stayed empty. I should have felt relieved, but the unease lingered. Who was in that car? Why hadn't the man mentioned them? About an hour later, I pulled into a gas station near the outskirts of a small town. The place was deserted except for a tired-looking cashier behind the counter. "Everything all right?" he asked as I paid for gas. I hesitated before telling him about the man on the highway. The cashier frowned. "That stretch of road doesn't get much traffic at night. You sure he was alone?" "No," I admitted. "There was someone in the car, but I didn't stick around to find out." He nodded slowly. "You did the right thing. Couple months back, we had a guy come through here saying he got carjacked on that same stretch. Picked up a stranded driver who pulled a knife on him." My stomach churned. "Probably just a coincidence," the cashier added, though his tone wasn't convincing. I didn't sleep well that night, even after reaching my brother's place safely. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked the local news. There was a report about a car matching the description of the one I'd seen. It had been found abandoned on a dirt road a few miles from where I'd encountered it. Inside, the police discovered signs of a struggle: a torn hoodie, bloodstains, and an empty wallet. But there was no sign of the man or whoever had been in the car with him. To this day, I don't know what I avoided on that highway. Maybe it was just bad luck, or maybe I stumbled onto something far more sinister. What I do know is that I'll never stop for a stranded car again. It started with a mistake, an innocent miscalculation. I'd underestimated the drive from Denver to Santa Fe, misjudging how much time I had before the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time I realized how far I still had to go, I was in the middle of nowhere. The stretch of highway between small towns was dark and lonely. I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour, and the occasional road signs offered little comfort. Next services, 35 miles, glared back at me as my fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. I told myself I'd be fine. There had to be a gas station up ahead, maybe even a motel where I could crash for the night. I just needed to keep moving. As if on cue, a weathered sign emerged from the shadows. "Sunrise Motel, 5 miles ahead." Relief washed over me. It wasn't my first choice, but it beat sleeping in my car on the side of the road. The motel appeared just as described, budget-friendly in the most generous sense. A single-story building with chipped paint, flickering neon lights, and a gravel lot with only one other car. I parked and walked into the small lobby. The receptionist was an older man with thick glasses and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. "Just passing through?" he asked, sliding a guest book across the counter. "Yeah, long drive. I need a room for the night." "Room 6, he said after I paid in cash. He handed me a key attached to a faded plastic tag. "Breakfast starts at 7, if you're still around." I nodded, though I had no intention of sticking around longer than necessary. The room was exactly what I expected. Outdated but functional. A sagging bed, a boxy TV, and an old desk with a chair missing one wheel. The bathroom smelled faintly of mildew, but at that point I didn't care. I just wanted sleep. I should have been exhausted, but as I lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, too complete, like the world outside had disappeared. Or maybe it was the faint hum, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the room. I told myself I was imagining things. Long drives can mess with your senses. But then came the sound. A soft tap, tap, tap against the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something or someone just beyond the glass. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I reached for my phone, but my fingers were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. The screen illuminated the room just enough for me to see the edge of the curtain flutter slightly. as if disturbed by a breeze that didn't exist. I forced myself to get up, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I finally pulled the curtain aside, I found nothing. The parking lot was empty except for my car and the receptionist's beat-up sedan. No footprints in the gravel, no sign of anyone lurking nearby. I told myself it was the wind or some loose branch scraping against the glass. Still, I double-checked the locks on the door and window before crawling back into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building, every distant rumble of the highway made me jolt awake. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because I woke up to the harsh buzz of my phone alarm. It was 6:30 a.m., and the first rays of sunlight were peeking through the curtains. I packed my things quickly, eager to get back on the road. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were footprints, barefoot by the look of them, leading from the gravel lot to my window. They didn't make sense. The ground was dry, and yet the prints were dark, like they'd been made by wet feet. I didn't bother reporting it to the receptionist. I just got in my car and left, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as I pulled onto the highway. But the story doesn't end there. About a week later, I found myself browsing online, curious about the motel. I wasn't expecting much, a handful of bad reviews maybe, but what I found made my blood run cold. The Sunrise Motel had closed down 2 years earlier after a fire gutted part of the building. There were no recent records of it reopening. I dug deeper, finding old news articles about the place. One headline stood out: "Local man disappears from Sunrise Motel room, authorities baffled." The article detailed how a traveler had vanished without a trace after checking into the motel. His car was found in the lot, his belongings still in the room, but there were no signs of where he'd gone or what had happened to him. I thought about the footprints outside my window, the tapping on the glass, and the strange hum I'd heard that night. Part of me wanted to believe it was all a coincidence, that the motel had somehow reopened without updating its records, and that the man in the article had nothing to do with what I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew better. I haven't driven that stretch of highway since, and I avoid motels whenever I can. Some places aren't meant to be revisited, and some questions are better left unanswered. I never considered myself the type to get spooked easily. I've camped alone, hiked remote trails, and even spent the night in abandoned buildings on a dare. But what happened last fall changed everything. It wasn't some ghost story or urban legend. It was something far worse. It started with a weekend getaway. My friends, Liam and Aaron, had found an isolated cabin rental online, deep in the Adirondacks. It was marketed as a rustic escape from modern life, complete with a wood-burning stove and no cell service. At the time, it sounded perfect, a chance to unplug and unwind. The cabin was about 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense forest. We arrived just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees. The place was as rustic as promised. A small, weathered structure with a creaky front porch and windows that seemed too large for their frames. It had a certain charm, though, and we were excited to settle in. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the stove, played cards by lantern light, and told stupid stories until the fire burned low. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the woods outside were silent, almost unnaturally so. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birdsong and decided to take a walk. The forest was beautiful, with thick moss carpeting the ground and golden light filtering through the trees. I followed a faint trail that wound past the cabin and deeper into the woods. After about half an hour, I noticed something strange. A clearing up ahead with what looked like a structure in the middle of it. Curious, I pushed through the underbrush and found myself standing in front of another cabin. This one was much older, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and decay. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. Something about the place gave me pause. It wasn't just the disrepair. It was the way it seemed deliberately hidden, as if someone had gone to great lengths to keep it a secret. I should have turned back then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, peering through a gap in the boards over one of the windows. Inside, the cabin was almost completely empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. To face the window I was looking through, tilted slightly as if someone had just risen from it. I don't know why, but the sight of that chair filled me with an inexplicable sense of unease. I backed away quickly, telling myself it was just an old hunting lodge or some forgotten property. When I returned to our cabin, I told Liam and Aaron about what I'd found. They were intrigued but didn't share my discomfort. "We should check it out later," Liam said. I agreed, though part of me hoped they'd forget. The day passed uneventfully. We spent most of it hiking and gathering firewood, returning to the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, things felt different. The woods, so alive with sound the night before, had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving the air heavy and oppressive. Around midnight, I woke to a sound, a faint creaking, like wood shifting under weight. At first, I thought it was one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom. But when I glanced around the room, I saw that both Liam and Aaron were still sound asleep. The creaking grew louder, closer. It was coming from the porch. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the window, I could just make out a shadow moving past, too tall and deliberate to be an animal. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the creaking stopped. And then, a knock. It was soft at first, almost polite, but after a few seconds, it came again, louder and more insistent. I froze, unsure of what to do. My first thought was that someone was lost and needed help, but the rational part of me knew how unlikely that was. We were miles from the nearest road, and the cabin wasn't exactly easy to find. The knocking continued, relentless. Finally, Liam stirred. "What the hell is that?" he muttered groggily. "I don't know," I whispered. "Someone's at the door." We both crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The porch was empty. Liam, braver than me, opened the door and shone his flashlight outside. There was nothing there, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. We convinced ourselves it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep, but the tension in the room was palpable. The next morning, we decided to check out the old cabin I'd found, hoping to distract ourselves from the night's events. When we arrived, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: fresh footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. They were large, barefoot, and led directly to the door. Inside, the chair I'd seen the day before was overturned, lying on its side as if someone had kicked it over in a hurry. "Let's go," Erin said, her voice shaking. We didn't argue. That night, none of us slept. The creaking returned, followed by the knocking, louder and more frantic than before. This time, it came from all sides of the cabin. First the front door, then the windows, then the back wall. By morning, we were done. We packed up and left without a word, driving back to town in silence. It wasn't until we stopped at a diner for breakfast that we finally spoke about what had happened. The waitress overheard us and frowned. "You were up near old Harper's place, weren't you?" "Who's Harper?" Liam asked. She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "He was a trapper who lived up there years ago, disappeared one winter, but people say he still wanders those woods, looking for anyone who might take what's his." We laughed it off at the time, but I haven't been back to the Adirondacks since. Whatever was out there, it didn't want us there, and I have no intention of finding out why. I've never been a fan of long drives. There's something about being alone on a highway for hours, the endless stretch of road in front of you, that always makes me uneasy. But that night, I had no choice. My job had relocated me to a small town about 4 hours away, and I had to get there as soon as possible. My phone had died, and the area I was passing through was so remote that there were no gas stations or rest stops for miles. I had to keep going. It was just before dusk when I left the city, and the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon. The sky turned an ominous shade of orange, and the road ahead stretched on, seemingly forever. The only other vehicle I had seen in the past hour was a beat-up truck that had passed me a few miles back. I could still see its headlights in the distance, but it was too far behind to make me feel any sense of safety. First, it wasn't so bad. The hum of the engine, the soft radio static, and the occasional chirp of crickets filled the silence. I tried to stay focused, keeping my hands firmly on the wheel and my eyes on the road. But the farther I drove, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The road was empty. Too empty. I hadn't seen another car in a while, and it was beginning to feel like I was the only person left on Earth. Then something caught my eye. Off to the side of the road, just past a small bend, I saw what looked like a figure standing in the darkness. It was hard to make out at first, just a dark shape against the trees. But as I got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was a person standing perfectly still, looking directly at me. They were wearing a long coat, and their face was hidden in the shadows. I slowed down, my heart racing, and tried to focus. Was it a hitchhiker? I had heard stories about people getting into cars with strangers, but this didn't feel like a typical situation. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, unmoving as I passed by. For a split second, I thought about stopping. I could offer help. Maybe the person needed a ride or had car trouble. But something held me back. There was something about the stillness of the figure that made my stomach churn. I didn't know why, but my instincts told me to keep driving. I pressed on, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. It was probably nothing, just some random person out in the middle of nowhere. But the thought of it lingered in my mind as I drove further. About 20 minutes later, I reached a small, run-down gas station. There was a single light flickering outside, and the place looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. I needed to fill up, so I pulled into one of the empty pumps and got out. As I walked toward the door to pay, I saw a figure moving inside the gas station, through the cracked glass windows. I froze. It wasn't the clerk. The person inside was tall, wearing a dark coat, and standing perfectly still, facing the door. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping over me. Maybe they were just waiting for something, or maybe it was just an odd coincidence. But as I took a few more steps toward the door, something felt wrong. Couldn't place it. The silence in the gas station was almost deafening. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I pulled on the door handle, but it didn't budge. Locked. I stepped back, confused, and looked around for someone to help, but there was no one in sight. The place was completely empty. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt a tight knot in my chest. There was no reason for the door to be locked at this hour, unless someone didn't want me inside. I looked back toward my car, considering whether to just get back in and leave. But then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. No one. I was alone in the parking lot, and yet it felt like I wasn't. I rushed back to my car and got in, locking the doors behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. But that strange, cold feeling lingered, pressing down on my chest. As I started the engine and pulled away from the gas station, I could have sworn I saw the figure again, standing just behind the building, watching me go. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me, that something had been watching me from the moment I passed by on the road, and now it was somehow closer. I drove faster, trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever it was. But as the night went on, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only intensified. The car seemed to rattle more than usual, the headlights flickering now and then as if they were struggling to keep up with the darkness. The radio crackled with static, and I couldn't focus on anything but the road ahead, the headlights casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move and shift in ways they shouldn't. An hour later, I reached the small town I was headed to. The lights of the main street flickered in the distance. I slowed down, grateful to finally be near civilization. But as I drove through the quiet streets, I noticed something strange. There was no one out. No cars, no people walking. Just the empty, quiet streets. I pulled into the parking lot of the hotel where I was supposed to be staying. The place looked deserted, and the lights inside flickered like they had been without power for a while. I walked to the front door, and as I reached for the handle, I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I could see it, standing just outside the window of the lobby, a figure in a dark coat, staring at me. It wasn't just anyone. It was the same person I had seen on the side of the road, at the gas station, and now here watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. And then the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it walked toward the door. I turned and ran, not looking back. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty streets as I sprinted toward my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if the person was behind me or not. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away.